right, everybody, let's go ahead and talk about photosynthesis. And this is just the introduction to photosynthesis. We'll really dive into photosynthesis soon. As usual, these ideas in this presentation are inspired by the work of David Konefsky. Thank you, David. Okay. Photosynthesis and cell respiration. This is a really crazy concept. They are completely reciprocal reactions. So what are we talking about here? So it says there's a reciprocal relationship between chemoheterotrophic nutrition and photoautotrophic nutrition. The inputs of one are the outputs of another. So what's a chemoheterotroph, I should say. Chemoheterotrophs are any organisms that eat. So that means that they, chemo refers to like chemicals in the environment, so like glucose, that kind of thing. Hetero means other, and troph means food. So they're eating others in order to get their food, their nutrition. Photoautotroph refers to organisms that make their own food, so through photosynthesis. So photo refers to light, auto means self, and then troph means food. So they make their own food using light energy. So the cool part is that the inputs of one are the outputs of the other. So take a look at the diagram, study the diagram, look at the chloroplast and look what is entering the chloroplast. So it looks like carbon dioxide and water are going into the chloroplast, and it looks like glucose and oxygen are coming out of the chloroplast. And then vice versa, look what's entering the mitochondria. That's the glucose and oxygen, and what's coming out is the carbon dioxide and water. So we say they're reciprocal reactions. So take a look, and you definitely need to write this down. You need to know these two reactions. And there's a couple things, you can pause it if you want to, but there's a couple things I'll say about the reactions while you're writing them. Oftentimes, we don't include the sunlight part of the photosynthesis reaction, nor the ATP part of the respiration reaction. Those are forms of energy, and they're not typically included in a chemical reaction when we're writing out the different molecules. So you will often see photosynthesis as 6 carbon dioxide plus 6 water, and then the arrow making 1 glucose molecule, that's what C6H12O6 is, and 6 oxygen. The oxygen is released actually as a waste product, and interestingly enough, a very good waste product. And then respiration, likewise, is taking that glucose and oxygen and converting that into 6 molecules of carbon dioxide and water, and then energy is formed in the form of ATP. All right, moving on. Plants, did you know, little known fact, plants are not the only photoautotrophs. Most of the oxygen in the atmosphere is generated by cyanobacteria and aquatic protists. So we have a few photos there. The multicellular algae like the seaweed that we think of as seaweed. Plants, there's the protists. Euglena is an example that has chloroplasts inside of it. The purple sulfur bacteria and the cyanobacteria. They're the ones that are making most of the oxygen in our atmosphere. Interesting, right? All right, and let's take a moment to talk about leaf anatomy specifically within the leaves. So take a moment to study the diagram. Notice there are there's the cuticle and there's the upper epidermis. And notice that the epidermis is not green. You can peel it away and it's just a clear layer. And that's because it doesn't have chloroplasts in it. The chloroplasts are located in the mesophyll cells. And you see some of those mesophyll cells are tall. They're called palisade mesophyll. Don't need to know that. And spongy mesophyll below them, but they're the ones that contain the chloroplasts, and so they're what make the plant look green. Also be aware that there's vessels that run through the leaves that carry the sugar and the water. And then down at the bottom, super important, make sure that you notice the presence of the stoma, or stomata is plural. Stomata are what allow carbon dioxide to enter and oxygen to be released out of the plant leaf, out of the leaf. Okay, the origin of eukaryotic photosynthesis. You don't necessarily need to write this down, but I can guarantee you that you need to know it. Just be aware of it for the College Board and for your AP exam. So it says first, anoxygenic photosynthesis appeared in bacteria. An means without oxygen. So it occurs under anaerobic reactions or conditions and does not produce oxygen. So that was what occurred first in terms of evolution. Oxygenic photosynthesis arose around 2.7 billion years ago. The abundance of photosynthesizing cyanobacteria at that time led to an accumulation of oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere and oceans, and that has now, scientists have come to know that as the Great Oxygenation Event, which took place about 2.5 billion years ago. And it turns out that may have been our first mass extinction on the planet. There's been at least 6 or 7 mass extinctions on the planet. Lots of the organisms, they believe, lots of the bacteria at that time, 2.5 billion years ago, were anaerobic, and the presence of oxygen was toxic. So all this oxygen ended up killing lots and lots of the organisms. So you can read more about that. We don't need to know about that for this class. So cyanobacteria are believed to be the ancestors of chloroplasts. So those are the ones that were engulfed during endosymbiosis. And remember, the evidence for endosymbiosis is huge and fascinating. The cyanobacteria have similarities with chloroplasts in terms of their ribosomes, in terms of their membrane organization, in terms of their DNA, all kinds of other evidence that indicates they were the ancestors of our modern day chloroplasts in plant and other organisms. Okay, so now back to stuff that you do need to know for sure, pigments and light absorption. So light is a form of electromagnetic radiation, and you're going to learn about that in physics class. Visible light is just a tiny slice of the electromagnetic spectrum, which includes things from X-rays and gamma rays to microwaves and radio waves. Light is a portion of the electromagnetic spectrum. Pigments, write this down, are substances that absorb visible light, and different pigments absorb different wavelengths of that light. So all you need to know is that first one. Pigments are substances that absorb visible light. So I want you to study this graph. Make sure you understand this graph. So along the bottom, it's showing you the wavelengths of visible light. It's possible my dog's going to start barking in just a second. Okay, so it's showing you the wavelengths of visible light, and it's measured in nanometers. Along the side, it says amount of light absorbed. So when you see a hill or a peak in the line, that's where they're absorbing a lot of light, light of that wavelength. And if you see a valley, that means that that pigment is not absorbing much in that particular wavelength of light. So it says it's called an absorption spectrum, shows the relative amount of light absorbed by each of the pigments. Now, these are 3 of the primary pigments that are found in plants. Chlorophyll A is far and away the most important of the pigments, and the others are called accessory pigments. They help chlorophyll A, but they're not as important as chlorophyll A. All right, now let's continue with this idea. Look at the diagram on the left. The top graph is basically the same graph that we were just looking at. So we've got the absorption, what percent of absorption is on the left, and then the wavelength goes along the bottom. So it says an action spectrum. That one was called an absorption spectrum. That's up at the top. Now, down below it is called an action spectrum. And an action spectrum shows the effectiveness of different wavelengths of light in powering photosynthesis all together. So you've got a whole bunch of different pigments that are in the leaf that are absorbing different wavelengths of light. And if you include all the different wavelengths of light, it shows that action spectrum, that graph down below, shows which wavelengths of light are really good for powering photosynthesis and which wavelengths of light are really stinky for powering photosynthesis. So if you look at the biggest valley in the action spectrum, that takes place around, 525, 550, somewhere in that ballpark, nanometers of light. And that tends to be in the green spectrum, which is crazy because that's what color the leaves are. And students are like, isn't that the best color for plants? It's exactly the opposite. It's the worst color for plants. Plants want blues, which are down below 500, blues and purples, and they want reds, which are above 600. So orange, yellow, red, those are the colors that they work with best. And green, the reason you see green is that it's reflected back to your eyes. It's not absorbed by the pigments that are found in the leaf. So it says, why is there a dip in the action spectrum around wavelength 550 nanometers? None of the pigments, look at the pigments up above, none of the pigments found in chloroplasts absorb light of 550 nanometers. Notice all of them, they dip down there. The action spectrum is a a joining of all of them, a merging of all of their most successful and least successful wavelengths. And you're seeing that none of them absorb around the 550 nanometer. So why are plants green? I already hinted at it. There are two major types of photosynthetic pigments that are found in plants. The first ones are the chlorophylls, and they absorb light in the red and blue violet ranges. Chlorophyll A, I mentioned, is the primary pigment involved in the light-dependent reactions of photosynthesis. We're going to learn a lot more about it. The carotenoids also absorb blue-violet light, but they do not absorb green light. So carotenoids and chlorophyll B are accessory pigments that pass their absorbed energy to chlorophyll A, and then allowing a broader spectrum of usable wavelengths for photosynthesis. So they all work together, even though chlorophyll A is the primary one. So KJ, you still haven't really answered why plants are green. Take a look at this diagram, super interesting stuff. If we're gonna show, if we have white light and we have a prism, the prism breaks it into a rainbow, and then we have a tool that has a teeny tiny little slot in it, we can allow just light of one color to pass through. So in the first example, they're showing just green light, and they have a solution in the test tube of chlorophyll. And notice that the chlorophyll, the green light passes through the chlorophyll solution to a photoelectric tube. Photoelectric tubes basically collect light and turn it into electricity, and the galvanometer records how much electricity. And notice that there's lots of electricity because lots of the green wavelengths are passing through the chlorophyll solution. We call it high transmittance and low absorption. So now we shift that black thing that has a slit in it, and we shift it so that blue light is passing through the chlorophyll solution. And crazily, is that a word, crazily? Crazily, the blue light gets absorbed, and very little light is absorbed by is picked up by the photoelectric tube. So very little electricity is converted, and we see low transmittance and high absorption. So not a lot of electricity is picked up by the galvanometer. So green light, get my picture out of the way here. Green light is not absorbed by any of the pigments, so it is reflected. When green light passes through the chlorophyll solution in the diagram, very little is absorbed. The photoelectric tube converts the light energy to electrical energy, which is then detected by the galvanometer. Blue light is absorbed by the chlorophyll solution, so very little electrical energy is detected. Our eyes see the reflected green light. It's reflecting back to us, and so that's why we see green. All the other colors are being absorbed. And then just as an FYI, pigments are located in the thylakoid membranes of the chloroplast. All right, didn't do that right. Another experiment that I want you to take a look at. It's a really interesting experiment done by Thomas Engelmann. So he was the first one to notice higher rates of growth of aerobic, so oxygen-loving bacteria on algae grown in blue or red wavelengths of light. So take a look at the diagram. So across the diagram is what's called blue-green algae. And then we've got this spectrum. And so Engelmann was growing all of this blue-green algae. And what he discovered, oddly, was that the bacteria were growing on the algae, but they were mostly growing in the blue and purple areas of the spectrum and in the red areas of the spectrum, but not very much in the green areas of the spectrum. And the question was, why? Why are those bacteria not growing there? Can you figure it out? They were not growing there because photosynthesis wasn't occurring, because the green light is being reflected and those pigments aren't absorbing the green light. And so photosynthesis wasn't occurring. So any of the algae that were growing in green light, they weren't photosynthesizing. What do they make during photosynthesis? Glucose and oxygen, and oxygen is what those bacteria needed in order to live. And so they weren't surviving very well in the green and yellow areas of that spectrum. So it says the aerobic bacteria needed oxygen, so they will thrive in locations where there is more photosynthesis and more oxygen production. The blue, purple areas of the spectrum and the red areas of the spectrum. Last thing, and then we're done. Photosynthesis is an anabolic. What does that mean? Let's see. Cat breakdance. So anabolic is building. Think about anabolic steroids, build your muscles, okay? Anabolic and endergonic process. It's not spontaneous. We're building things, the plants are building things, and it does not happen spontaneously. So just a few things to sort of wrap your brain around. Carbon dioxide is removed from the atmosphere. We call that carbon fixation, and it's coming in through the stomata of the leaves. And water is removed from the environment. That's generally coming up through the roots and being carried by the xylem. Remember that word from earlier? The xylem of the plant. So those are the vessels that carry water. Water is then split. And so water is broken into hydrogen and electrons and oxygen. The hydrogen ions are combined with carbon dioxide. So you have H, C's, and O's. And that makes the sugars. Remember, glucose is C6H12O6. That's where those C's, H's, and O's come from. And then the energy from the sunlight is used to power the building of these energy storing sugars. Remember, this is an endergonic process. It doesn't happen spontaneously. So energy has to be added. In this case, it's the energy of the sunlight. The sunlight doesn't have any chemicals in it. It's powering the reaction. It's allowing the carbon dioxides to be removed and the water to be split. That's really the part that the sun's energy is needed for. All right, we're going to stop there, everybody. Let me know if you have any questions. We'll learn about full-on photosynthesis next.